Let's put it that way. I think that is
Welcome. Oh, I can turn that up. There we go. Just in case you don't want to be filmed the whole time. There we go. We are excited. We have people who will be joining us live stream, people who will watch after the fact. We have people here, which I have to tell you, live stream people, it is best here, but some of you may not even be able to get to Utah. I don't know, but you can find it. You can help me. I can help you find Utah. And we are now on, everybody, get ready, the 72nd house concert. Oh, yeah, fine. Now, it's not the 72nd time in my own home. It does jump around, but it is the 72nd time. And wow. But something you need to know with our storyteller today, Julie Barnson, is that she actually kicked us off. So 72nd right now, she actually did the very first one back in December of 2015. So December 2015 was our very first one. And we've been doing it every month. For some reason, 2020 was an interesting year, but we adapted, right? We did some outdoor house concerts, but it's still really hot outside. And it's kind of nice, I think, to be here. I mean, this right now, it seems like it still feels much better than outside right now. Hopefully, that was the plan. Okay, good. In fact, maybe you even feel, light, dare I say it, because what we will be hearing tonight is George MacDonald's The Light Princess. So this is a literary tale, and it's one big piece. And I have heard this before, and I love it. And maybe you're familiar with it as well, or maybe this is your first time, but I am ready for this adventure. We'll see what you think at the end. So let us have a round of applause to Julie Barnson.
And does anybody know the story of George MacDonald's The Light Princess? I'm so excited then. Let me tell you just a little bit, and hopefully I remember to tell you the answer at the end. But George MacDonald was a writer who was friends with Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland. And they were writing buddies, so they would trade works and read each other's stories. And when he gave Lewis Carroll the story of The Light Princess, Lewis Carroll said, "This is a great story, but you cannot publish it because it's not appropriate." Oh. And so you listen to the story and see if you can figure out why this story would not be considered appropriate in the 1800s. George MacDonald's The Light Princess. Long ago, so long ago, I have quite forgotten the date. There was a king and a queen who had no children. The king, he looked around at the other kings and queens, and they all had children. Some had 1, some had 2, some had 8, some had 12. And he looked and he said, "But we have no children. I feel ill-used." And so he decided he would be angry with his wife about it. His wife, the queen, was a very gentle and patient person. And when he got cranky about things, she just smiled and said, "Sweetheart, you can't rush these things." And she was right. And he knew she was right. And he felt bad about it. So he resolved that he would do better. And I have to tell you that he succeeded at it very badly. So it was more than he deserved when, after years of waiting and hoping and praying, they finally were blessed with a child, the sweetest little princess that ever cried. Now, when you have waited and hoped and longed and prayed for something for such a long time, of course, you want to share in the blessing. So when it came time to christen the child, they invited everybody that they could think of. And as king and queen, they knew a lot of people. So invitations went out by the hundreds. And when you have a guest list that long, it is understandable, forgivable, that you might forget somebody. But when you forget somebody, perhaps you shouldn't forget your own sister, especially when she's an actual wicked witch. It's really not the king's fault. I mean, his own parents had forgotten about her and they had left her off of the will when they died, and he hadn't spoken to her in years. It didn't even occur to him. They honestly didn't even think about it. Oh, but that witch was ready and was waiting for her invitation. And when she didn't get one, she was vexed. The king's sister, the witch, she was a malicious and spiteful thing. Her face was creased with lines of peevishness that crossed with lines of spite. When she was angry, her eyes flashed red. When she was jealous, her eyes flashed green. What they flashed when she loved somebody, I have no idea, because to my knowledge, she never did love anyone, not even herself, except after a whole lot of practice. So when she didn't get her invitation, she resolved that she would go anyway. And she made some plans. And when she showed up on the day of the christening, and she was welcomed and ushered right in, which was even worse because they forgot that they had forgotten her. And they invited her to the table and they sat her and they were so polite, and she just fumed and stewed all through the dinner. And when the banquet was over, they opened up the chapel and everybody filed in for the christening. She very quickly maneuvered her way through the crowd until she was right up at the front, right by the baptismal bowl. And as the priest was speaking and saying the words with the nurse holding the baby and all of the things, just before the priest was going to reach into the water to baptize the baby girl, she threw something into the water, twirled on her heel, and uttered the words, "Light of spirit by my charms, light of body every part, never weary human arms, only crush thy parents' heart." 3 things happened at once. First, the witch vanished in a puff of smoke. Second, the little baby started to laugh. And third, the nurse gave a sudden shriek, because at that very moment, that nurse could no longer feel the baby in her arms. In truth, the nurse thought she had suddenly been struck with some kind of a paralysis, because here she was holding a baby who felt like nothing as she was holding her. And after that initial shriek, realizing that she was in front of dozens of hundreds of people, she bounced that sweet little child and held her and did nothing as the priest finished the baptism and everybody came and saw the princess. And then when things were finally over, she went upstairs with the baby and began pacing back and forth in a panic because she couldn't feel that child. There was nothing that she was holding. And she was bouncing the baby, wondering what she was going to do and what was wrong with her and how she was going to solve this, as the baby just giggled and laughed as sweet as could be. And as she bounced up, she let go just long enough that the baby went up to the ceiling. And the nurse became aware that perhaps it was not her that was the problem. But what was she supposed to do now? Because she realized that her job was on the line if the baby stuck on the ceiling somewhere. She had to go fetch a page boy who fetched a ladder, and they climbed up and they managed to hook, the princess's little dressing gown, and she carried her down, and the nurse didn't know what to do. Who would she tell? And so she didn't tell anyone. But the secret wasn't kept for very long, because after a few hours, the king and queen sent for their daughter, and the nurse brought the baby down to the throne room and handed it over to the king. And the king did what all fathers do with their little babies. It's, "Oh, who's a sweet little princess? Oh, yes, aren't you just the sweetest little thing?" And he bounced her up and down, and he bounced her up, and she went up to the top of the vaulted ceilings of the throne room. The king looked at the child. He looked at his wife. He looked at the child. He looked at his wife. He said, "She can't be ours." The queen said, "Oh, my darling, I am most assured that she is indeed ours, only perhaps we should have been a little bit more careful of who we invited to the christening. And the king said, it doesn't matter. What do we do now? She's way up there. How do we get her down? And that proved to be quite a difficulty. They had to bring in the council table, a big, tall, heavy thing. And then they put the throne on top of the council table and they climbed on top of that. And then they had to get a pole arm from one of the guards to scoop up and just barely catch the princess's dress and pull her down. The princess had been cursed to lose all of her gravity. She weighed nothing, not anything. And the king and the queen, they had no idea what they were going to do. What does one do when one's child has no gravity? It was the next morning that the king, when he was in his counting house, counting out his money, and he was looking at the gold coin that he was counting and realizing that the gold coin weighed more than his own child. And the queen, she was in the parlor about to take a snack of her favorite bread and honey. And as she was bringing the bread and honey to her mouth, she burst into tears. And the king heard her and he came out and said, what is it? And she said, I can't eat this. And he said, of course not. You just had breakfast. And she said, no, sweetheart, it's our daughter. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the king, he said, I don't know. She said, your sister, she's a witch. I saw her there. Did we even invite her? And he said, I don't remember. And she said, couldn't you go talk to her? Apologize. Ask her if she did it. Just apologize. Whatever it needs to be done. Tell her you're sorry. Tell her we're sorry. See if she'll do something. And he did. He went out to the edge of the kingdom where she lived in a little hovel there. And he knocked on the door. And when she answered, he said, we're sorry. We're so sorry. Please take it away. If you can, please take it away. And the witch looked at him and said, I have no idea whatsoever what you're talking about. Be patient and mend your ways, and slammed the door. The king thought about asking his royal physicians and advisors, but he was afraid they might do experiments on her. And it wasn't long after that the nurse, she was in the nursery with the baby, and she put the baby down on the bed. In truth, the baby never actually touched the bed. The baby rested just above the bed. And she was bustling around. It was a hot day, and she opened up a window to let some fresh air in and just left for a minute to go to put something away. And the queen came in. The queen didn't notice the baby lying there, and she felt it was stuffy in the nursery. So she opened up another window directly across from the window that was already open. And she left, and a nice gentle breeze swooped in, picked up the princess, and carried her right out the window. The nurse didn't even know. She came back. She saw the baby was gone and thought that the queen perhaps had taken the baby with her. And so after a few hours, she came back and she said, Your Majesty, would you like me to take the baby back up to the nursery? And the queen said, wait, I don't have the baby. And the nurse said, I don't have the baby. I thought you had the baby. They quickly summoned every servant in the house to go and look and search for the princess. And when they saw the nursery and the open windows, they thought, oh no. Because if a good breeze came through, she could just go and go and go, and there wouldn't be anything to stop her. The servants quickly grabbed big butterfly nets and ran outside into the garden, calling for the princess. They found her. Oh, they did. A rose bush had snagged the princess's clothing, and she was dangling from the rose bush, just laughing with petals and leaves just falling down around her. And they started to realize just how dangerous this situation actually was. There couldn't be any time that the princess could be allowed to be alone, because any little breeze could blow her away and horrible things could happen. So they had a system where at all times there were several servants that were required to be around her. And in truth, the servants loved it because this was a baby who never, ever cried, the most cheerful, sweetest baby you could ever imagine. And she was really great fun to play ball with. She was the ball. They found that if you tossed her just the right angle, she would dip down, not touch the floor, and just go right up into the other person's hands, and they could throw her back and forth. And except for that one time when the servant was standing in front of the fireplace and he missed the baby and she went into the fireplace and up the chimney, and they had to call the chimney sweep to fetch her down, except for that one time. Nothing ever really happened, and they were happy, and the princess grew up. As she grew up, they started to notice there was more than just her weight issues that were a problem. They said she laughs too much. If you talked about somebody being sick and dying, she would laugh. It would be, if they talked about war and people being slaughtered, she would laugh. It would be, and her laugh was a little odd. It was like she laughed, but it wasn't truly happy. Like, because she had never cried, there was no sadness in her. There couldn't be any real happiness either. There was no joy. And so it just sounded strange and loud. And she laughed at everything. And the king and the queen, they wondered if they should do something. What should they do? It was always the question, and they never really knew, but they thought perhaps they should have a talk with her. But they never got around to it. And finally, one day, they realized that something had to be done when the princess went out for a walk in the garden. Now, for the princess to go for a walk in the garden, it meant that she had to be attached by ropes around her waist to about 6 different servants, so that if she veered off course, they could pull her back. And she just drifted along the path as the servants kind of moved her along. And as she was walking in the garden, the king and a page boy were coming toward her. The king was dictating a message to the page boy, and she saw her daddy and simply had to give him a kiss. Now, what they found is that if the princess held something in her hands, it would keep its weight. It wouldn't become weightless. So she found she could run if she carried something heavy. It was kind of a bounding, slow motion, walking on the moon kind of a run, but she could run. So she wanted to run ahead and give her daddy a kiss. So she scooped up very quickly a rock in one hand, and as she went to pick up another rock, she missed, and she picked up a toad that happened to be there by the rocks. And so with rock and toad, she closed her eyes and she puckered her lips and she ran forward. And because the toad is just a little bit lighter than the rock, she veered off course, and she ended up kissing the page boy and smacking her father in the face with the bullfrog. The king was embarrassed. The page boy was embarrassed. The princess laughed, and the event was forgotten by her, but not by the king. They had to do something. They brought the princess in, and they sat her down. She drifted above the seat, and they said, "Sweetheart, you're 17 now, and we thought we should have a talk about what you should be doing with your life right now. Perhaps you have noticed that you aren't quite like other people." And she said, "I am too. I have 2 eyes. I have a nose. I have a mouth. I'm like everybody." And they said, "Well, maybe you noticed that you don't touch the ground." And she goes, "I did notice that. Yes." They said, "Well, sweetheart, is there something that you want to do with your life? Something a goal that you have?" And her eyes lit up, and she said, "Oh, yes, there is. I have had this goal ever since I thought of it this morning. Will you let me have it, please? Oh, please." And they said, "We don't promise anything. What is it?" And she goes, I want so desperately, will you tie me to a string and fly me high up in the air like a kite? And I will throw sugar plums down on all the children in the kingdom. Please, can I have that? The king said maybe it was time to call the physicians. They had two physicians that hated each other. One was Humdrum and the other was Kopikek. Humdrum was a spiritualist. That meant that he believed everything had a spiritual source. He examined the princess and he said, it is very clear to me that the princess's spirit is not of this earth. Before she was born, her spirit was roaming the cosmos and she was sucked down to this physical body here on this planet, and she does not belong here, so she cannot touch it. I resolve that we should set upon a course of study. She must know the names of every plant, every animal, every language, every people, every culture. She must know it all. And when she finally knows all of the things about this earth, she will know that she belongs to it and she will be able to walk upon the ground. And Kopikek said, oh, yes, and she'll die of boredom first. And the two of them started to argue, but it was Kopikek's turn to examine the princess. Now, Kopikek, he was a materialist. He believed that everything came from a physical source. He examined the princess and he said, it is very clear to me that the princess suffers this malady because her blood is circulating the wrong direction through her body. So I believe that if we drain her of all of her blood and set up a pump with one hand and to one foot and pump it back in the opposite direction, she will then be able to walk and be cured like normal. And Humdrum, of course, if she doesn't die first, what do you think you're doing? You are stupid. You're an idiot. And the two of them fought, and the king thought both sounded terrible. And he didn't do any of them. When a solution came, it came by accident, as all things do. This kingdom happened to lie on the shores of a very large and beautiful lake, which meant whenever they had a celebration, it was on the water. And it was the founding of the kingdom. There was a huge party, and all of the nobles and wealthy people, they all had barges and boats that were out on the lake. And on the shoreline, there were booths where you could buy all sorts of sweets and play games and have toys and balloons. And all of the peasants were along the shoreline, and everybody would be out on the water. And the king, he was coming out on the water with his daughter, who was tied to the boat. And she was so excited because she had a friend on the barge and she was waiting so anxiously to see her. And as they got close to the royal barge, the king untied his daughter and he went to toss her up to the people that were waiting to catch her. But as he stood up to toss her, he tripped. And instead of tossing her up, he threw her down into the water. And she went into the water. And she didn't come back up. And everybody ran to the side of the boat and looked over to see what had happened to her. And they were watching so carefully. And suddenly there were bubbles coming up from the water. And as they popped, they could hear. And the princess finally came to the surface and her eyes were bright. And she said, that was wonderful. Let's do it again. When she was in the water, she had gravity. She wasn't floating around. She could be in the water. It was a miracle. And it was so amazing that Humdrum and Kopikek did something that they had never done before in their entire lives. They agreed on something. They said, given that she had an affinity for the water, if they buried her for 3 years in the earth, then she would have an affinity for the ground and would be cured. And when the king looked really angry at that solution, they changed their minds, discussed, and agreed a second time that if somehow the princess could produce her own water, as if she could cry, she would be cured. Something, finally, a solution. All they had to do was get the princess to cry. That wasn't as easy as you might have thought. They would bring in the most pathetic beggars and people who had the most sorrowful stories. They would tell their stories and tales of woe and dread. And they would bring the court to tears. And what did the princess do? She laughed at everything. The king got so frustrated that it has to be said, the king, he tried spanking her. And she laughed through the whole thing, and he felt horrible, and he resolved to never do that again. But in the meantime, the princess could go out swimming. She swam from morning until late at night. And she was so happy. And when she was in the water, she was a little more normal. You could talk to her, and she wasn't quite so out there. And they loved it. And during the day, there would be servants around her to watch and talk with her as she swam, and they swam with her sometimes. And in the evening, it was the best time ever, because the servants, they would go in and they would leave the princess alone in the water on the lake. She'd never been alone in her entire life. She treasured those moments because she could swim, and it was the best. There was, at the edge of the lake, there was this little stream that went to a pond right underneath the balcony of her bedroom window. And there was ivy growing, and she found that she could swim right under there. She could grab a hold of the ivy, and hand over hand, she could pull her up, grab the curtains, pull herself over the balcony, and she could be in her bedroom. And the servants never even knew that she did it. She looked down from her window, holding on to the curtains, and she would wish she could just jump in. That was the big dream for her, but she knew that was never, ever going to be possible. But in the meantime, she would swim every day, and as best she could, she was happy. So we're going to leave our princess for a little time and tell the story of a prince who was ready to get married. Now, this prince, he had met all of the other princesses in his area. He had met all of the noble girls, and he met girls who were very nice. He met girls who were very smart. He met girls who were very beautiful, but he often thought, when he fell in love with somebody, he thought that there should be, a spark, a something that just made his heart just leap. And he never really found that. He met amazing people, but he just didn't feel it. So he resolved that he would go on a quest for a bride, and he got his courtiers and all of his friends and servants to go on a big trip where they would travel to other kingdoms. And while he was traveling on those other kingdoms, he met girls who were very smart and sweet, clever and beautiful and kind. But they all just didn't have that something that said to him, this was the one. Well, he'd heard about our cursed princess, and he thought, oh, curse, I don't want to deal with that. So he wasn't going to go see her at all. But something remarkable did happen on his trip. He got lost, which, if you have read your stories, it is only after the prince ditches all of the servants and the courtiers and gets good and lost and is off by himself that things actually start to happen. And so he did. He got lost, and he found himself alone in a very large wood. And he wandered and wandered for days and weeks and months, perhaps, until he found himself on the shores of a very large and beautiful lake. And it was nighttime. There was a moon shining up ahead, and he was walking along the shores of the lake when he heard a sound. It was, and I've told you, her laugh was a little weird. And so when he heard it, he thought, oh no, somebody's drowning. I must rescue them. And so he ran along the side of the lake until he went out and he saw something in white splashing on the water. And he didn't even think about it. He dove into the water. He swam out to the damsel in distress, obviously. he grasped a hold of her. He led her to the side. And then things got strange because as he went and helped her out of the water, she went up and she kept going up until she caught a hold of the branches of the pine tree that were up on the ledge just above him. And she stood there holding on to the branches of the pine tree, and her face was flushed and her eyes were bright. And she looked at him and she said, "You naughty, naughty, naughty man, you put me back in the water right now." It was the first time that she had ever been angry. And as he looked at her with her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed and her eyebrows lowered, he felt it right there. That was it. The spark, the thing that he was waiting for. And he lost his heart to her at once. And he said, "Oh, my fair maiden, I am apologetic at this error. I am so sorry. Perhaps I can then help you." And so he climbed out of the water and he went up onto the ledge, and he had to jump up to catch a hold of the gown that she was wearing. And he pulled her down and he held her in his arms. And oh my goodness, he couldn't even feel her. She weighed almost nothing. And he stood there and looked at her and he said, "So you wanted to be in the water, yes?" And she said, "Yes." And so he said, "Very well then, fair maiden." And he jumped into the water. And when she came up, her eyes were still bright, but they were bright with excitement. And she had a smile on her face and she said, "That was wonderful. Let's do it again." The prince was happy to oblige. So he helped her out of the water and he took her up to the ledge and he jumped in again. And they did that all night long. And when the sun was about to come up, she said, "I have to go now." And he said, "I probably should too." And she led him to that little stream, to the pond underneath the balcony. And she said, "Shh, the servants never know how I get in." But he lifted her up and she grabbed a hold of the ivy and pulled herself up and climbed over the balcony. And he said, "Wait, will I see you again?" And she grasped a hold of the curtain and she said, "Yeah, okay, sure." And she went inside. He found an abandoned hunter's cabin to sleep in. And when he woke up that afternoon, he went to find his love. And he saw her, but she was surrounded by everybody, all of these servants. And he was a little shy about his newfound love. He didn't want to just go announce himself suddenly right there in front of everyone. So he waited. And after a time, all of the servants went inside and the princess was alone. So he went and he joined her. They swam together every single night. And yes, he knew that this was the princess who was cursed. And he talked to her, so he knew she wasn't quite all there. But, when they were in the water, they could still talk about things. And he would talk about love and marriage. And he wasn't sure she was really listening, but he knew that he would get through to her eventually. And given how much more normal she was, once they were married, perhaps that they would go live with the mer people or something so that they could be in the water all the time. That was okay with him. He was fine with that. And he swam with her night after night after night, and they were so happy until one night. As they were going to their favorite place to jump off into the water, the princess noticed that the line where the lake was, there was the wet mark where the water level was. The water was lower than the mark that it usually was. The lake was lower. It was lower. She became alarmed and she started to swim to different places. And she looked and she saw that the water was lower all around the lake. And the prince was swimming after her going, What is it? What? And she ignored him completely. She called into the castle and said, "Send the scientists." And they all came out and they did measurements and they determined that, yes, the water level in the lake was much lower and it was getting lower every day. The princess was so frantic and so distraught, she forgot about the prince completely. And the prince, he didn't even know what to do. He faded into the background, letting her be worried about whatever it was she was worried about. And she saw the lake draining every day, and she became so upset that she wouldn't even come out of the castle anymore. Oh, the lake was indeed draining. You see, word came to the witch that the princess was happy, that she was swimming happily every single day. Well, when you curse somebody, you don't want them enjoying it. So she decided she had to take matters into her own hands. In her little hut, she had a large washing tub, and she filled that with water. Then she went to a chest that she had in her home, and she lifted up the lid. She rummaged through until she found a large ring of keys, and this she set aside. And then she dug some more until she found what looked like a dry, gray, wrinkled piece of skin. And when the tub was full, she went over the tub and she dropped that piece of skin into the water. Then she grabbed a rag and she went and got the ring of keys and began polishing the keys so that they were nice and shiny. As she was polishing, the water in that tub started to swirl. And as it swirled, suddenly out from that tub came this pale serpent that slithered over the side of the tub and across the floor. It came up the back of the witch and rested its head upon her shoulder and flicked her ear with its tongue. She stroked it and then picked it up and gathered it in many coils and wrapped it around her body and made sure it was comfortable, grabbed that ring of keys and went down into the basement of her house where there was this round door with a lock. She used one of the keys to unlock the door, and when it opened, she revealed a set of stairs going down and in to the land. And she went down, and at the bottom of those stairs was another door and another key. And down another set of stairs with another door and another key. 99 sets of stairs and 99 keys. She went down until the final door was opened and revealed a very large, spacious cavern that happened to be underneath the very lake where the prince and princess were swimming every single night. She uncoiled the serpent from around her body and straightened it up. And she lifted it up by the tail and she began parading it around this cavern while the serpent began searching back and forth across that ceiling. She circled that cavern completely once and twice until suddenly the serpent struck and its fangs sank into the stone of the ceiling. And as soon as it had struck there, the queen, the witch, let go. And it dangled there and she said, "Oh, drain it dry, my pretty. This is what living is for." You should know that this is one of the dreaded white snakes of darkness, a more evil creature you could ever imagine, never imagine. It hung there for quite some time, just hanging there. And when finally it dropped to the ground, it became nothing more than a dry, gray, wrinkled piece of skin, which the witch picked up, put in her pocket, and she watched as the ceiling of that cavern darkened with moisture, and it all coalesced to a drop that dripped down. And another drip, and another, and another. And soon there was a stream. And the witch, she picked up the keys and she walked back up 99 sets of stairs, locking each door behind her. And all she had to do was wait. The lake was dropping, and it was dropping so fast. And the princess, with each time that the water level dropped, she became more and more distraught, to the point where everybody said that if that water drained, she would probably die. They didn't know how she could survive it. But it was interesting because it wasn't just the water of the lake that was dropping. It was also all of the streams and rivers that fed into that lake. They all dried up. and the rain stopped. It was a drought unlike any drought they had ever seen. They even said that all of the babies in the kingdom stopped crying. So they didn't even have tears to water the land, not anything. The water dried to the point there was just puddles and ponds and fish flapping, and people could just walk out onto the lake bed, gather up what fish they wanted, and go back and have a feast for dinner. It wasn't what anybody wanted. And kids would go out and would play on the lake bottoms, even though the parents said, don't get muddy, they did. But it was the children that found the plaque there at the bottom of the lake. And they very quickly went and showed it to the guards, who ushered them into the king after making them wipe their feet because, gosh, you're muddy. But this plaque, it was written in a language so old, only the finest scholars knew it. And when they had gathered, they had read on the plaque, it said that if at such time that the lake level dropped so low that it was going to destroy the kingdom, all they had to do was find where the water was draining. And then somebody had to sacrifice their life and stand in that hole and keep the water from draining, that the lake would fill back up and the kingdom would thrive again. Well, that was great. All they had to do was wait for somebody who wanted to die for their country to come along. And the king sent out the proclamation and actually expected somebody to accept. And he was a little bit disappointed when nobody did. Now, the prince, he had faded into the background. He got tired of the hunting cabin and felt like he had to do something. So he went to the castle and he got a job. He was actually given the job to be the princess's shoe polisher, which was the most useless job you could ever imagine, because to my knowledge, the princess had never touched the ground enough to ever scuff a shoe. But he polished each shoe till it sparkled and did it lovingly every day. He heard about the proclamation and his heart sank. Oh, he did not want to do it. He didn't want to do it. But he knew he loved her and that he would have to step up. And so when nobody else came forward, he steeled himself and he knocked on the door to the king's counting house. And the king opened up and said, hello. And he said, yeah, I came to offer myself to sacrifice and stop the water from draining from the lake. And the king said, well, where have you been? Thank you. We are so glad to have you. All right. Are you good for tomorrow? And he said, wait, I have some requests. And the king said, oh, indeed. He said, I would like the princess to be there with me. I don't want to do this alone. I want her to be able to see me and to talk to me and perhaps, give me food and drink and be there. But that's what I ask. And the king said, well, it's done. And thank you very much, son, for this. And the very next morning, the king and all the courtiers, they went out with the prince and they walked out on the lake bed and they escorted the princess. They had her tied to the boat again. And they brought her out and they set her down on the ground that used to be a lake. And when she saw how bad the lake was, she cried out and hid her face and wouldn't look up at all. And the prince, he found where the water was draining. It was just right there, and he was able to step both of his legs into it, but there was still a little bit of a corner that was draining, and so he had to bend over and put his hands down. And when the water was stopped, the water did start rising. It covered up where his hands were, and everybody waited, and the king waited until finally he said, all right, then we're going to leave you to that. I'm going in, and thanks again for this, son. And he left, and everybody left with him. And the prince was alone with the princess, and she wouldn't even look at him. She hid herself for quite some time until the water rose enough that the boat started to move. And she got so excited and she looked up at him and she was so hopeful. And he said, Princess, I asked you here so that you could talk to me. And she said, okay. And he said, perhaps you could give me something to drink. And she said, oh, sure. And she reached into the boat where she had a basket of goodies and some water, and she gave him something to drink. And he said, could you talk to me? And she said, okay. But as she looked at the water that was rising, she really didn't talk very well. And he'd have to remind her all the time, hello, I'm here. Can you talk? And he had to remind her all the time, could you give me something to drink? Could you talk to me? And she sang songs a little bit. When the water got deep enough, she looked at him and she said, let's go swimming. And he said, oh, princess, I wish you many days of swimming, and I wish you so much joy in it, but I won't be able to join you anymore. I am going to die here. And she said, oh, okay. And it didn't go very well, but eventually the water rose up till it was covering his chin, and he was feeling a little desperate and a little bold. And so he said, Princess, would you perhaps give me a kiss? And she said, oh, yes, of course. And she leaned over and she closed her eyes and she touched her lips to his. And when she pulled away, she had a confused look on her face. And the water very quickly covered the lips so that he was blowing the water out from between them. And he tilted his head back as far as he could with his hands down. But then he covered his mouth and he was breathing from his nose. And the princess watched as the water covered his nose. And then he fell down into the water. And as he went into the water, she felt something. She looked and she said, no. And she untied herself and she launched herself into the water, and she reached down and she grabbed the prince and she dragged him up, and she screamed for the people in the castle to come, please come, send the doctors, please come. And she brought him to the shores of the lake, and they all came, and he wasn't breathing on his own. And so they came and they helped him to breathe. And they brought him into the castle and they worked with him, and the princess came with them and she stayed with him, and they worked all night long to get the prince to breathe on his own. And when the sun finally came up that morning, the prince drew breath on his own, and the princess started to cry. And she cried and she cried, and every bump and bruise and bang and sorrow that she had never cried for her entire life, she cried it all out now, and she couldn't stop. The tears just came and came. And at that very moment, it started to rain, and all of the babies in the kingdom started to cry. And she cried out every heartache and sorrow and just wept and wept as the water came pouring down out of the sky, and the rivers and the streams, they all filled and ran into the lake, and the lake water continued to rise. And when the princess cried until she could not cry anymore, she tried to get up and couldn't. Everything was so heavy. She had been so light before. She didn't know what this was. Why was she so heavy? But it turned out that Humdrum and Kopekek were right. By getting her to cry, she was cured. And it was awful. She didn't know how to walk. She didn't know how to move. Everything hurt. Oh, how did people even do it? But when things got hard, the prince was there by her side to help her. And she got stronger, and it got a little easier. And it must be said, the princess was very gracious, because she never did anything to her aunt, the witch, except that when the witch was required to be there for state functions, she made a point of stepping on her foot really hard. But the prince was there by her side, and they really were in love. I should tell you that the water filled and filled and filled the lake until it burst through the lake bottom and down into that cavern where the water had been draining. And it filled that underground cavern. It filled it to the point where it burst through 99 doors and went up 99 sets of stairs. And it collapsed that hut where the witch was living. And she was in it at the time. And she was crushed and killed. And not a single person mourned her death. But as for the prince and the princess, they got married. And at the wedding, they wore crowns of gold and clothes of cloth and shoes of leather. And in time, they had children, both of boys and of girls, not one of whom ever had a problem with their gravity. The Light Princess. Now, I told you that Lewis Carroll said that the story was very inappropriate and that George MacDonald couldn't publish it. It was because the prince and princess went swimming together. Oh, that is just not done. Very scandalous. But there you go. The Light Princess. Thank you so much for coming.
Can you see why I love that story so much? And out of curiosity, who it's their first time? It's their first time hearing that story. Okay, so now if you suddenly need more of George MacDonald, there are more stories out there. So as a librarian, I happen to know that one that is very popular is The Princess and the Goblin. So if you need more, you can look out for it. In fact, it's been turned into plays and you might suddenly see it out there. But then you're like, wait, I need more of Julie Barnson here. She is fantastic. She tells this story. She tells all kinds of stories, actually. And it was great debate for her to come here. I knew no matter what she did, but deep down, I needed that story again. She told it back in 2020, back in January 2020, when it was kind of different then, right? It was great, but I needed it again. And she actually tells that to her sixth graders every year. So she keeps up on it. And I'm like, well, if you don't mind, I'd like it again. So she does a lot of stories, but in case you're like, wait, she told that in 2020. Well, sometimes stories just have to be repeated, right? So then the next time you could hear it like it's the second time, then you won't have to raise your hand for the first time on that, right? Now, for those who are live streaming or are going to be watching it later, just so you know, you're not going to get the refreshments, but you're still loved. And for everybody, whether live stream or here, we always appreciate it. People can come whether or not they donate, and it actually helps Story Crossroads, but actually also helps Julie Barnson. So if you are like, oh, wait, I would like to do something, that'd be great. There is so much when it comes to our thanks to not only individuals, but also to a lot of organizations. We've been getting continuous grants. And so the Utah Humanities, they gave us a nice big grant for this coming year. And they have since the beginning for us. Or the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, they have funded us from the beginning. And we're going to be going on our 9th Summit and Festival in May of 2024. And that will be exciting too. Also, keep in mind, we do have these house concerts. We jump around. So we're right now in West Jordan, Utah. It's going to be jumping to Ogden. And so, yeah, I know that's probably good for you. So you can join us there as well. So both, in person and live stream is possible. That will be outdoors. They have a lovely shaded outside. In case of rain, we had that last year when they hosted. It's indoors, but we're hoping for that nice, beautiful shaded outside. And that will be Ted Erickson. He actually is more towards the Logan area. And so Ogden wasn't so far for him to perform, and he is hilarious. He could get serious too, seriously funny. So yeah, so that just gets the mood of that. And there's flyers of that. Or if you're watching this, I'm going to share the screen and you can see a little bit more as well. So it's time. It's time. I'm grateful for my family helping out and getting these foods. Actually, because the Light Princess, I couldn't help it. I had to have cream puffs. It just feels like you have to have cream puffs when you have the Light Princess. And then I also have eclairs. And then, of course, I always like having gluten-free options. So we have strawberries, some grapes, and of course, water is very good. That's a light thing, isn't it? Water. Oh, and all the swimming. Oh, okay. I get excited. So anyway, let's another round of applause for Julie Barnson. And she does have CDs of this, which I have. The tricky part is more and more people don't have CD players, but if you do and you're like, I gotta have this, she forgot to bring them today. But if you do order it, then I'll make sure to get it to you and just kind of, be all good. Won't worry about mailing or anything. I'll just and maybe someday you have the digital file, so maybe you can do a flash drive of the Light Princess. Okay, she'll let us know. But in the meantime, you were here. This is the in-person, or if you're watching it later, you still got to experience this. So
It's on YouTube.
yeah.
It's on YouTube.
All right, so enjoy. Go forth.
Get into it.